The wind howled across the empty plains of Wyoming territory, carrying with it the sting of dust and the cold promise of winter. Jacob Mallister stood alone at the edge of his land, his hat pulled low against the biting wind. The sun was sinking behind the distant mountains, turning the sky the color of dying embers. His rough hands gripped a fence post, the same one he'd driven into the ground 5 years ago when he first claimed this unforgiving patch of earth as his own. The year was 1882. Jacob was 34, a man built from work and silence. His ranch stretched over 200 acres of stubborn ground, land that gave little and demanded everything. He raised cattle when he could, but drought and wolves took more than they left. His cabin, small and plain, stood behind him, a single room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. No curtains, no flowers, no softness. It was a place meant for survival, not comfort. Inside that cabin, the silence was a living thing. When he sat down to eat his nightly meal, salt pork and beans again, the quiet pressed so hard it made his chest ache. For years, Jacob had told himself that solitude was a kind of strength, that needing no one was the only way to endure. But lately, the stillness had begun to feel heavier. Some nights, he found himself talking to the horse, to the cattle, even to the wind, just to hear the sound of a voice. It was at the general store in Cheyenne that old Pete Murphy had first planted the idea in his head. Jacob had been loading supplies when Pete leaned over the counter with his usual gossiping grin. "Heard tell there's a service back east," Pete said. "Marriage brokers. They match frontier men like you with women wanting a new life. You write letters, make arrangements. They send your bride west on the stage." Jacob had laughed it off at first. The thought of buying companionship like a new plow felt wrong. But as the nights grew colder and the prospect of another winter alone settled over him, the idea began to take root. Maybe it wasn't about buying anyone. Maybe it was about giving two lonely lives a chance to meet halfway. One stormy night, Jacob sat at his table with a piece of paper in a shaking hand. He wasn't a man of fancy words. Still, he tried. "To whom it may concern," he began, then crossed it out. Too formal. He started again. "I am looking for a wife." That sounded too blunt. Finally, he wrote honestly about his ranch, his cabin, the hard work, and the quiet beauty of Wyoming. He told the truth, that life here was harsh, but honest, that he could offer safety, steadiness, and a home, if not riches. He didn't mention the loneliness pressing at his ribs like an old wound. 6 weeks later, a letter arrived. The broker's response was formal, businesslike, but included a small photograph, a tintype of a woman named Ruth Harper, a widow from Pennsylvania with 2 young children. Her face in the photograph was thin, her expression serious, but her eyes, steady and clear, held something that caught Jacob's breath. Ruth was seeking a new start, the letter said. She could work hard, new farm life, and wanted a safe home for her children. Jacob turned that picture over and over in his rough hands that night, studying every line of her face. She looked strong, capable, and maybe, beneath the sorrow, a little like someone who'd forgotten how to hope, just like him. For the next few weeks, Jacob prepared. He fixed the loose floorboards, built 2 small beds from pine planks, whitewashed the walls, and even bought fabric for curtains from Pete's store. The barn got new straw, the chicken coop a proper door. Every repair was an act of faith, a silent promise that maybe this time the silence would end. When the stagecoach from Cheyenne finally appeared on the horizon, Jacob's heart beat faster than it had in years. He stood by the general store, freshly shaved, his best shirt buttoned tight. Dust rose in clouds as the coach rattled to a stop, horses snorting and sweating from the long run. The door opened. A small boy, maybe 6, jumped down first, landing in the dirt with a thud. His clothes were worn, his hair wild, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. He turned back and reached up a hand to help a girl, slightly older, down from the step. Then came their mother. Ruth Harper was nothing like he'd imagined. The photograph hadn't shown the faint lines of worry around her eyes or the quiet grace in the way she moved. Her dress was travel-stained, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, but she carried herself with dignity. When her gaze met his, it was steady, not frightened, not timid, but guarded. "Mrs. Harper," Jacob said, removing his hat. His voice felt rough, rusty from disuse. "Mr. Mallister." She gave a short nod. "These are my children, Thomas and Mary. Pleased to meet you both." The little boy grinned shyly, but the girl stayed close to her mother, her small face unreadable. Around them, the townsfolk had gathered to stare, whispering. The mail-order bride. The lonely rancher. Ruth must have heard them, because her hand tightened on her children's shoulders. "My wagon's right there," Jacob said quickly. "It's a long ride to the ranch. Best we get going." Ruth nodded once, then began loading their few belongings. A single trunk, 2 carpet bags, and a small wooden crate the boy refused to let out of his sight. Jacob lifted the heavy trunk into the wagon bed, catching the faint scent of lavender from within. When they finally set off, the road stretched ahead, endless, dusty, and quiet. Ruth sat upright beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, her children in the back among the supplies. For a long while, no one spoke. It was Thomas who broke the silence. "Mister, is that your horse following us?" Jacob glanced back to see Duke trotting faithfully behind the wagon. "That's Duke," he said. "Guess he didn't want to be left behind." "Can I ride him?" the boy asked eagerly. "Thomas," Ruth warned. Jacob smiled. "Maybe, if your ma says yes." Ruth's eyes flicked to his. Something softened, just a little. "We'll see," she said. Hours later, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, Jacob pointed toward a small cluster of buildings on the horizon. "There it is, the ranch." Quote, Ruth straightened, studying the land that would be her new home. The cabin looked small against the endless sky. The barn leaned slightly. It wasn't much, but the smoke from the chimney rose steady and sure. Then Ruth spoke, her voice calm but unyielding. "Mr. Mallister, before we go any farther, I need your word on something." He slowed the horses, turning toward her. "My children have lost everything," she said, one hand resting protectively on each small shoulder. "If I step into that cabin, it must be with your promise that you'll treat them as your own, that they'll have your protection, your kindness, your name." Jacob met her gaze and saw no fear there, only strength. "Ruth," he said quietly, "your children will be my children. This home will be theirs. You have my word." For a long moment, Ruth studied him, then nodded once. "Then we'll enter your cabin, Mr. Mallister," she said softly, "and see what kind of life we can build from this beginning." The first days at the ranch passed, like walking on thin ice. Everyone moved carefully, speaking little, learning how to live together under one small roof. Ruth rose before dawn, her quiet footsteps the first sound Jacob heard each morning. She scrubbed the cabin from floor to ceiling, hung the curtains he'd bought, and unpacked their few belongings with military order. Thomas and Mary followed her lead, polite and cautious, as if afraid to touch anything that wasn't theirs. Meals were silent. The scrape of spoons, the crackle of the fire, the occasional whisper from Thomas were the only sounds. Jacob wanted to say something, to ask if they were comfortable, but the words never came easily. He spent more time in the barn than usual, fixing things that didn't need fixing. The animals were simpler. They didn't expect him to talk. It was the chickens that finally cracked the silence. On the 4th morning, a shriek broke through the cold air. "She's pecking me!" Thomas yelled from the chicken coop. Jacob ran out to see the boy running in circles, chased by an angry hen. Mary was laughing behind her hands, torn between fear and amusement. Without thinking, Jacob jumped the fence, scooped Thomas up, and lifted him out of reach. "That's Bessie," he said, pointing to the hen puffed up like a thundercloud. "She's guarding her eggs. Can't blame her for that." Thomas's wide eyes turned from fear to curiosity. "Will they be baby chickens?" "If we're lucky," Jacob said, setting him down gently. "In a couple of weeks." Mary had come closer now, her dark braids swinging. "How do you know which ones will hatch?" she asked shyly. Jacob found himself explaining, showing them how to tell which eggs were warm, which nests were fresh. The children listened, their faces bright in the morning light. When Ruth came to the door, she found all three of them leaning over the fence, heads together. Something soft flickered in her eyes. "Breakfast is ready," she said quietly. For the first time, her voice didn't sound like stone. After that morning, things began to change. Slowly, like frost melting under the sun. Thomas followed Jacob everywhere, eager to learn ranch chores. He asked endless questions. Why did the cattle have brands? Did they feel pain? How could he tell one horse from another? Jacob answered everyone, patient and steady. Mary stayed closer to her mother but watched everything. One afternoon, Jacob found her struggling with a bucket of water too heavy for her small arms. "Here," he said gently, "fill it halfway. 2 trips instead of 1. She looked up at him seriously. Papa used to say that. It was the first time either child had mentioned their father. Jacob just nodded. Sounds like he was a smart man. The days grew colder. Jacob and Ruth worked side by side preparing for winter. He fixed fences and brought the cattle in from the far pastures while she stacked wood and salted meat. She was strong, stronger than he'd expected. She didn't flinch from hard work or bad weather, and when she smiled, rare but real. The whole cabin seemed brighter. Still, a quiet wall stood between them at night. Ruth and the children slept behind the partition Jacob had built, while he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft murmur of her voice as she told stories. The sound made something ache inside him, a mix of longing and peace he hadn't felt in years. Their first trip to town tested everything. They needed flour and salt, and Ruth wanted to enroll the children in the little schoolhouse. The ride started cheerfully enough. Thomas chatted nonstop about learning to ride Duke, while Mary pointed out hawks circling in the sky. But when they reached town, the whispers began. People stared. A woman buying fabric whispered to another, "That's the one, the mail-order bride." Another murmured, "Poor thing. Had to sell herself to a rancher." Ruth's back stiffened, but she kept her chin high. Inside the schoolhouse, Miss Downing looked the children over like they were stray pups. "We'll take them," she said with a tight smile, "though they'll likely be behind our standards." Mary lifted her chin. "I can read and cipher," she said quietly. "I help teach the younger ones back home." Miss Downing only smiled thinly. "We'll see." The ride home was silent. Thomas stared at the floorboards. Mary's small hands were clenched in her lap. Ruth sat rigid beside Jacob, her face pale but proud. That night, Jacob found her sitting by the dying fire after the children were asleep. She didn't hear him at first, and he saw the tears she was trying to hide. When she realized he was there, she quickly wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm not usually given to this." "You don't need to be sorry," Jacob said softly. "People in town don't know what strength looks like when they see it. They'd rather gossip about it." Ruth gave a shaky laugh that wasn't really a laugh at all. "They think I sold myself, that you bought me." "I didn't buy you, Ruth," Jacob said quietly. "I asked for a partner, someone who could stand the storms beside me." Her eyes lifted to his, and for the first time since she arrived, they held no distance between them. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. "You could have stayed alone. It would have been easier." Jacob hesitated, then told her the truth. "Because the silence was killing me," he said. "Because I wanted to matter to someone again." Ruth looked into the fire for a long moment. "I understand that," she whispered. "After James died, after we lost the farm, I felt like I was fading away. The only reason I kept going was them." She nodded toward the partition where the children slept. "They needed me." "They still do," Jacob said. "And they've got more now. They've got all of us." Ruth smiled faintly. "Do they? Are we a family, Jacob?" He met her gaze. "I'd like to think we're becoming one." She nodded slowly, then stood. "Then I'll do my part to make sure we are." She paused at the partition, her hand brushing his shoulder as she passed. "Thank you for trying." Jacob sat long after she'd gone, staring at the fire until the last embers dimmed. The cabin felt different now, warmer somehow. The wind outside still howled, but inside there was the quiet sound of life. A woman's breathing, children's dreams, hope, small but growing, like a flame refusing to die. The next morning, when the first snow fell across the plains, Jacob stood at the door and watched Ruth and the children scatter corn for the chickens. Their laughter rang out against the cold air, soft but strong. And for the first time since he could remember, Jacob Mallister didn't feel like the loneliest man in Wyoming. The months that followed tested them all. By late November, the drought came early, turning the Wyoming plains into cracked earth and dust. The creek that once ran through Jacob's pasture slowed to a trickle, then dried completely. Cattle wandered, weak with thirst, their ribs showing through their hides. Jacob stood at the edge of the empty creek bed one morning, his hat low against the sun. Duke snorted beside him, uneasy in the dry wind. Ruth came up quietly behind, her skirt brushing the brittle grass. "How bad?" she asked. He didn't sugarcoat it. "If the snow don't come soon, we'll lose half the herd." She said nothing, just stared at the horizon where heat shimmered like smoke. Then she reached for the bucket in his hand. "Then we haul from the Anderson well. The children can help." Jacob looked at her, sweat running down his temple, exhaustion deep in his eyes. "You don't have to." "I do," she said simply. "This is our home now." That word "our" stayed with him all day. A week later, trouble came from the east. Elijah Thornton, Jacob's neighbor, had always been a mean-spirited man, quick to anger, slower to forget. His cattle had begun straying onto Jacob's land, drawn by what little water remained. When Jacob sent Thomas to drive them back, Thornton accused the boy of spooking a pregnant cow into losing her calf. "That's a lie," Thomas cried when he came home, his face red with anger. Ruth pulled him close, but Jacob saw the tremble in her hands. She knew Thornton's kind of man, one who used power like a whip. A few days later, Ruth went to town for supplies. Thornton blocked her wagon halfway down the trail. When she returned, her jaw was tight, her voice flat. "He said things," she told Jacob, "things no decent man should say. About me, about you." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. "I'll have words with him." "No," she said sharply. "That's what he wants. A fight. We can't afford more trouble." But trouble came anyway. Fences were cut in the night. The chicken coop door left open. Obscene words painted on the barn where the children could see. Ruth scrubbed the wood clean with lye soap until her hands bled. "He's not breaking us," she said quietly. Then, one gray morning, Ruth's scream tore through the yard. Jacob rushed out to see Mary sprawled in the snow, crying, and Thornton standing there holding Duke's reins, the saddle packed with stolen gear. "Get off my land," Jacob said, his voice cold as the wind. Thornton sneered. "You can't work this place alone, Mallister. You'll lose it come spring. Sell it to me now, and I might let you keep your little family warm another year." Ruth stepped forward, pulling Mary close. "We don't sell what's ours." Thornton's eyes slid over her in a way that made Jacob's stomach turn. "You sure about that, ma'am? Winter's long. Accidents happen." Before Jacob could speak, Ruth strode up and snatched the reins from his hand. The leather cracked across Thornton's face with a sharp slap. "You come near my children again, and I'll shoot you where you stand," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "Now get off this land." Thornton's face went red, then pale. "You'll regret that," he growled, then rode off. After he was gone, Ruth sank to her knees in the snow, pulling both children into her arms. Jacob knelt beside them, his good arm circling them all. "He won't hurt you," he said softly, "not while I'm breathing." That night, while the fire burned low, Jacob made his choice. At dawn, he rode to the Anderson ranch, his injured shoulder throbbing, and told Sam everything. By evening, word had spread across the valley. The next day, when Thornton returned, a dozen men stood waiting in Jacob's yard. The Andersons, the Millers, the Clearys, even old Tobias with his rusted rifle. Sam spoke first. "You've been making threats against this family, Thornton. That don't sit right with any of us." Thornton blustered, cursed, but the sight of all those men, armed, steady, unafraid, broke something in him. He turned his horse and spat in the snow. "This ain't over," he said. "It is," Sam answered. "You bother this family again, you'll answer to all of us." When the men rode away, Ruth stood in the doorway, tears shining in her eyes. "They came," she whispered, "for us." Jacob nodded. "You see, we're not alone." That night, as the snow began to fall heavy and soft, Ruth kissed his cheek for the first time. "You kept your word," she said. "You made my children yours. You made us a home." The months that followed weren't easy. The drought turned to flood, a fierce storm tearing across the plains. Their barn nearly collapsed, the creek rose like a monster, and Jacob injured his shoulder again trying to save the livestock. But this time he wasn't alone. Ruth took charge, leading the animals to higher ground, the children hauling feed, shouting over the roaring wind. When Jacob faltered, she steadied him. "We're partners in this," she said fiercely. "You rest when you must. You're not alone anymore." By dawn, the storm passed. The cabin still stood. Mud clung to everything, but they'd made it. Together. Weeks later, when the spring sun melted the last of the snow, hope returned with the green shoots of grass. The ranch still bore scars, but life had taken root again. Ruth's garden grew. The cattle fattened. Jacob carved toys from wood with his healing arm, small horses and dogs for Thomas and Mary. Then came the banker. 3 months behind on the mortgage, he said. Either pay or leave. Ruth stood straight, her chin high. "You'll have your money," she said. "This is our home." And she meant it. Ruth took in sewing for the neighbors. Jacob sold his carvings at Murphy's store. Thomas helped with chores in town, while Mary tutored the smaller children in reading. Bit by bit, coin by coin, they built their future from dust and faith. By summer, word spread of the family that refused to quit. When the banker returned, the yard filled with wagons. The Andersons, the Millers, the Clearys, all bringing coins and bills, small but honest. "Not charity," Sam said, setting down a box. "Investment in good neighbors." When the count was done, Ruth's hands shook. "It's enough," she whispered. "We're paid in full." The judge smiled. "Then this ranch belongs to the Mallisters, free and clear." That evening, the valley gathered to celebrate. Fiddles played, children laughed, the smell of stew and bread filled the air. Jacob stood by the fire, watching Ruth dance with Mary under the golden sky. Thomas chased other boys with a wooden horse Jacob had carved himself. When Ruth came to him later, breathless and laughing, he pulled her close. "From a lonely rancher to a family man," she teased. He smiled, brushing a lock of hair from her cheek. "From a woman with nowhere to go to the heart of my home." She looked up at him, her eyes soft and steady. "So this is what home feels like?" Jacob nodded. "Home is where promises are kept." The stars came out bright over the Wyoming plains. The land still bore the scars of storms and struggle, but the cabin glowed warm against the dark. Jacob Mallister, the lonely rancher who once bought a wife, had found something no money could ever buy, a love born from hardship, sealed by promise, and made strong by the family who called him Pa. And the woman who once said she'd only enter his cabin if her children became his too, had kept her word. Now they all shared one name, one home, one heart,